The music was a river of gold, flowing through the grand ballroom of Silverwood Keep, and Clara, for a brief and glorious moment, was floating upon it. She loved these nights, not for the stifling politics or the brittle smiles of the court, but for the moments when Alaric's gaze would find hers across the expanse of polished marble. In those moments, he wasn't the king, burdened and severe, but the man she had married, the one whose laughter, rare as it was, could make the sunlit gardens feel like their own private world. Her gown, a deep sapphire that matched the stone at her throat, felt less like armor and more like a second skin. She felt alive, her heart a fluttering bird in her chest. She was moving toward him now, a plate of delicate almond cakes in her hand, a treat she knew he favored but would never request himself. It was a small, secret language they shared. A gesture of care in a life governed by ceremony. He was speaking with the formidable Duke of Blackwood, his posture rigid, his expression a mask of regal indifference. But she saw the tension in his jaw, the faint line between his brows. He was tired. The trade negotiations had been dragging on for weeks, and the Duke was a notoriously stubborn man. Clara's steps quickened with a surge of protective tenderness. She would offer the cakes, a silent message of support, and perhaps her presence would soften the Duke's granite demeanor, if only for a moment. Her focus was entirely on Alaric's face, on the weary set of his shoulders, so much so that she failed to notice the small, almost invisible ripple in the Aubusson carpet, a buckle in the ancient wool raised by the heel of a passing courtier. Her slipper caught. The world tilted on its axis, a dizzying, sickening lurch. The plate of cakes flew from her grasp, a constellation of white powder and shattered pastry arcing through the candlelit air. She flailed, a desperate, graceless motion to regain her balance, but momentum was a cruel master. She tumbled forward, her hands thrown out to break her fall, and landed in a heap of sapphire silk and profound humiliation at the feet of her husband and the Duke of Blackwood. For a heartbeat, the entire ballroom held its breath. The music stuttered and died. 1,000 pairs of eyes, like 1,000 sharp needles, pricked her skin. The only sound was the faint, mocking tinkle of a silver fork skittering across the marble floor. Shame was a physical thing, a hot, creeping tide that flooded her cheeks and burned behind her eyes. She could feel the Duke's stare, cold and assessing. But it was Alaric's silence that truly terrified her. She pushed herself up, her movements clumsy with haste and mortification, her hands trembling as she tried to smooth her ruined gown. She finally dared to look up at him. The man she loved was gone. In his place stood the king, and his face was a storm cloud carved from ice. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, held no warmth, no flicker of concern, only a cold, annihilating fury. He did not offer a hand. He did not ask if she was hurt. He simply watched her, his expression making it clear that her physical state was irrelevant. It was her failure that mattered. The Duke of Blackwood, ever the diplomat, cleared his throat. A minor slip, Your Majesty. The carpets in these old castles can be treacherous. His voice was smooth, but his eyes held a glint of something she couldn't name, pity, or perhaps satisfaction. It didn't matter. Alaric ignored him completely. His focus was a physical weight pressing down on Clara, pinning her in place. He took a step forward, his voice a low, venomous snarl meant for her ears alone, yet it seemed to echo in the cavernous silence of the hall. You are a stain on my dignity, he hissed, each word a perfectly crafted dart of poison. You are the Queen of Eldoria, not a tavern wench stumbling through a barn dance. This clumsiness, this artless display, it ends tonight. Kill these clumsy habits, or I will replace you with a consort who understands the meaning of grace. The threat hung in the air between them, shimmering and deadly. Replace you. The words shattered something deep inside her. It wasn't just a political threat, it was a visceral rejection of her, of the woman she was. He wasn't asking her to be more careful. He was commanding her to annihilate a part of herself. The part that moved with unguarded joy, the part that sometimes forgot the 1,000 critical eyes that watched her every move. The part of her that was, simply, Clara. She looked into his unforgiving face and saw a stranger. The warmth she had seen moments before was a phantom, a memory of a man who no longer existed, or perhaps had never existed at all. In that moment, something inside her broke, and something else, colder and harder, began to form in its place. She rose to her full height, the trembling in her limbs ceasing as a strange, chilling calm descended. She met his gaze, and for the first time, her eyes were as empty as his. As you command, my king, she said, her voice a perfect, crystalline whisper. And with a nod to the stunned Duke, she turned and walked away, her back straight, her steps measured, each one a silent vow. He wanted a queen of ice and stone. He would have one. The transformation began the very next morning. Clara dismissed her ladies-in-waiting, women she had considered friends, whose gentle chatter had filled her chambers with a semblance of warmth. Their easy familiarity was a liability now, a reminder of the person she was forbidden to be. In their place came tutors. Monsieur Duval, the dance master, a man whose spine had never known the concept of slouching, was the first. He did not teach her to dance, he taught her to move. 4 hours each day, she walked the length of the solar with a stack of heavy books balanced on her head, her arms held just so, her chin at the precise angle of regal authority. "A queen does not walk, your majesty," he would say, his voice a dry rustle of silk. "She glides." The floor is beneath her notice. Any stumble, any hesitation, was met with a sharp rap of his cane against the floorboards and a withering sigh of disappointment. The muscles in her neck and back screamed in protest, but she ignored the pain, focusing on the cold, hard weight of the books, letting it seep into her soul. Her next tutor was Alara, a former courtesan of the old court, a woman whose face was a beautiful, unreadable mask. Alara's domain was etiquette, but her true subject was stillness. She taught Clara how to sit for hours without fidgeting, how to hold a wine glass without her fingers trembling, how to listen to the most tedious council report with an expression of serene interest. "Emotion, your majesty, is a weapon to be used, not a weakness to be displayed," Alara would murmur, her voice like honey laced with frost. "Your face is the property of the crown. It must reveal only what you intend it to reveal." They practiced in front of a large, gilt mirror. Clara watched herself for hours, learning to tame the flicker of a smile, to banish the furrow of a brow, to empty her eyes of all but a placid, impenetrable calm. She watched the Clara she knew fade away, replaced by a polished, perfect stranger. Her voice was the final frontier. She had always spoken with an earnest passion, her words sometimes tumbling over one another in her excitement. Alaric had once teased her for it, calling it her river of words. Now, that river had to be frozen. She spent her afternoons with the royal orator, a man who spoke in sonorous, perfectly modulated tones. He taught her to breathe from her diaphragm, to lower the pitch of her voice, to speak slowly, deliberately, each word chosen with the precision of a jeweler selecting a stone. Laughter was the first thing to be completely eradicated. It was too spontaneous, too artless. A small, closed-mouth smile, executed with precision, was permissible. Nothing more. The sound of her own laughter, which had once filled the gardens, became a distant echo, a ghost of a life she no longer lived. 3 weeks into her training, Alaric found her in the library after midnight. She was practicing her walk, a single candle her only light, the shadows stretching like grasping fingers around her. He had stopped, his expression unreadable in the gloom. "Clara," he had said, his voice softer than she had heard it in weeks. "It is late." She had paused, turned, and executed a perfect, shallow curtsy. "My king," she replied, her voice the cool, measured tone she had practiced for 100 hours. "I was merely correcting a flaw in my posture. I will not allow it to happen again." He had stared at her, a flicker of something, confusion, regret, in his eyes. He had taken a step toward her, his hand slightly outstretched. She did not flinch or recoil. She simply remained still, a statue of alabaster and moonlight, waiting for his command. The space between them, once filled with easy affection, was now a chasm of perfect, silent etiquette. His hand dropped to his side. "Very well," he had said, his voice suddenly clipped. And he had turned and left her alone in the darkness. She stopped touching him. It was not a conscious decision, not an act of rebellion. It was simply a consequence of the new rules that governed her existence. A queen did not initiate contact. Her hands, once so quick to smooth his brow or rest on his arm, were now kept gracefully clasped at her waist. When they walked together, she maintained the prescribed distance, a foot of empty air separating them like a wall of glass. In their bed, she lay perfectly still on her side, a marble effigy in the moonlight, her breathing even and slow. She no longer reached for him in the night, no longer sought the warmth of his body. Her own body had become a fortress, and its gates were sealed. The clumsy girl who tripped on carpets was dead. The passionate woman who loved her husband was buried with her. In their place stood the Queen of Eldoria, flawless, graceful, and utterly, terrifyingly silent. She was everything he had commanded her to be. A perfect jewel, polished until every facet was sharp and brilliant, and all the light within it had been extinguished. The first time he saw the result of his command in its full, horrifying glory was at a meeting of the small council, 2 months after the fateful ball. Clara had never attended these meetings before. She had claimed, with a laugh that he now recalled with a painful ache, that the discussion of grain tariffs and border disputes made her head spin. But today, she had entered the council chamber behind him, her movements a fluid, silent poem. The assembled lords, grizzled and cynical men who had seen kings come and go, fell silent. They stared. She was wearing a gown of severe grey silk, her hair swept up in an intricate arrangement of braids that left her neck long and vulnerable, yet she looked as impenetrable as the castle walls. She took her seat beside his throne, her back ramrod straight, her hands folded serenely in her lap. Lord Valerus was droning on about a dispute over lumber rights in the Northern Territories. It was a tedious, circular argument he had made a dozen times before. Normally, Alaric would have seen Clara's attention begin to wander. She would have subtly shifted in her seat, or her eyes would have drifted to the patterns of sunlight on the floor. He would have felt a small, secret smile touch his own lips at her barely concealed boredom. But today, she sat as still as if carved from marble. Her gaze was fixed on Valerus, her expression one of placid, unwavering attention. She did not blink. She did not move. She simply was. Alaric found his own attention drifting, not from the tedious report, but to the woman beside him. He studied her profile, the perfect, classical line of her nose, the smooth column of her throat. She was beautiful. More beautiful, he supposed, than she had ever been. A masterpiece of regal perfection. A queen for poets to praise and painters to capture. The Duke of Blackwood, the same man who had witnessed her fall, leaned forward. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice laced with a newfound respect. "The Queen's presence lends a certain gravity to our proceedings." A model of decorum. Alaric nodded, a tight, automatic gesture. He felt a flicker of pride. This is what he had wanted. A queen who commanded respect, who betrayed no weakness, who was his equal in station and in bearing. He had ordered her to kill her habits, and she had obeyed with a terrifying efficiency. He had demanded a queen, and she had forged one from the ashes of the woman he had married. But as the meeting dragged on, the pride began to curdle into a strange, hollow unease. Her stillness was not serene, it was absolute. Her silence was not thoughtful, it was empty. He watched her for a full 5 minutes, and in that time, the only thing that moved was the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of her chest. She was breathing. It was the only proof he had that she was still alive. Later that evening, he sought her out on the battlements. The sun was setting, bleeding crimson and gold across the western sky. It was a view she had always loved. She used to lean against the cold stone, her hair catching the wind, and talk for hours about nothing and everything. He found her standing there, but she was not looking at the sunset. She was staring straight ahead, her hands clasped behind her back, her posture as rigid as a soldier's. He came to stand beside her, the familiar scent of lavender and rose from her skin now so faint it was barely there. "The sunset is beautiful tonight," he said, his voice feeling loud and clumsy in the quiet air. "Yes, Your Majesty," she replied, her gaze not shifting. Her voice was calm, pleasant, and utterly devoid of feeling. It was the voice she might use to comment on the weather with a foreign ambassador. He tried again, a desperate edge creeping into his tone. "Do you remember the first time we stood here? You told me you thought the clouds looked like a fleet of burning ships, a ghost of a memory, one he had cherished." Her answer came without a moment's hesitation, as if recited from a book. "I do not recall, Your Majesty. My memory of such trivial things is not what it once was. Trivial things. Their shared moments, their private jokes, the soft, unguarded pieces of their life together, were now trivial." He felt a cold dread snake its way around his heart. He had commanded her to be a queen, and in her relentless obedience, she had excised everything that was not royal, everything that was simply Clara. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the sleeve of her gown. It was an impulsive gesture, a desperate need to feel something, to connect. She did not pull away. She did not react at all. She simply stood there, allowing the contact, as inert and unresponsive as the stone beneath her feet. His hand fell away. He had polished the diamond of his wife until he had ground it to dust. And now he was left with nothing but the cold, sharp, worthless grit. The days bled into weeks, the weeks into a season. The court marveled at their new queen. They called her the Ice Queen, the Marble Majesty, the Silent Sovereign. They spoke of her grace, her unshakable poise, her flawless decorum. They saw a symbol, an ideal of queenship made flesh. Alaric saw a ghost haunting the halls of his palace. He saw an exquisitely crafted automaton performing the functions of his wife. Breakfasts were silent affairs. She would eat with meticulous precision, her napkin placed just so, her movements economical and soundless. He would try to start a conversation, speaking of state matters, of the harvest, of anything at all, and she would respond with perfect, brief, and impersonal courtesy. Indeed, Your Majesty, as you say, my king, I have no opinion on the matter. Her eyes never truly met his. They would focus on a point just over his shoulder, or on the knot of his cravat. It was a subtle but complete erasure of him as a person. He was her king, her sovereign, the source of her commands, but he was no longer her husband. The silence between them grew, a living entity that filled every room they shared. It was heaviest in their bedchamber. He would watch her at her vanity, her lady's maid brushing out her long, dark hair. Clara would sit perfectly still, her eyes on her own reflection in the mirror, but her expression was blank. There was no pleasure in the ritual, no vanity, only a quiet, patient endurance. When she came to bed, she would lie down, fold her hands over the coverlet, and close her eyes. Sleep seemed to claim her instantly, a seamless transition from stillness to absolute stillness. But Alaric knew she was often awake. He could feel the rigid control in her body even in the darkness, the careful, shallow breaths she took. He would lie there for hours, the space between them a frozen river, aching with the desire to reach out, to shake her, to scream until a flicker of the old Clara returned. But he did not. What could he say? I have changed my mind. The command is rescinded. How could he order her to feel again, when he was the one who had commanded her to stop? One afternoon, he found a small, forgotten book of poetry in a dusty corner of the library. It was one she had loved, its pages softened with use, the corners of her favorite verses still faintly turned down. He brought it to her chambers, a foolish, hopeful tremor in his hand. She was arranging flowers in a vase, her movements precise, each stem placed with geometric accuracy. The resulting bouquet was beautiful, symmetrical, and completely lifeless. I found this, he said, holding out the book. I thought you might like to have it back. She turned, her eyes glancing at the book and then to his face, her expression unchanging. Thank you, Your Majesty, she said, her voice a cool, smooth stone. She took the book from him, her fingers brushing his for a fraction of a second. Her skin was cool. She did not open it. She simply placed it on a nearby table, aligning its spine perfectly with the edge. It was just another object in a perfectly ordered room. The gesture was more devastating than any angry words could have been. He had not just taken her laughter and her grace, he had taken her joy, her passions, her very self, and she had let him. She had handed him the pieces of her soul, and he had commanded her to throw them away. The hollowness inside him became a chasm, an emptiness so vast he feared it might swallow him whole. He looked at the perfect queen he had created, and for the first time, he truly understood the monstrous nature of his own pride. The grand banquet was meant to be the pinnacle of his reign, a celebration of the new trade alliance with the Southern Isles. The great hall was a masterpiece of opulence. Banners of gold and crimson hung from the rafters, and 1,000 candles glittered in the chandeliers, their light reflecting off the polished silver and sparkling crystal that covered the long tables. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meats, mulled wine, and expensive perfume. The drone of 100 conversations, punctuated by bursts of laughter and the music of a string quartet, created a symphony of success. Alaric sat at the head of the high table, a golden circlet on his brow, the weight of his crown and his kingdom on his shoulders. And beside him, his queen was a vision of perfection. She wore a gown of spun silver that seemed to drink the candlelight, and a necklace of diamonds glittered like frozen stars at her throat. Her hair was a marvel of engineering, a complex structure of coils and braids held in place by dozens of pearl-tipped pins, all of it surmounted by the heavy, ornate queen's crown. She was breathtaking. Every lord in the hall stole glances at her, their expressions a mixture of awe and admiration. She was the perfect consort, a testament to his power and taste. And as Alaric looked at her, a wave of such profound and desperate misery washed over him that he felt his breath catch in his chest. She sat like a statue. Her posture was flawless, her spine straight, her hands resting lightly on the table. When she drank from her goblet, the movement was a study in fluid economy. When she ate, it was with a delicate precision that left no stain, no crumb, no sign that she had taken any pleasure in the act. She listened to the prattling of the Southern ambassador on her right with an expression of serene interest, inclining her head at the appropriate moments, offering a murmured, "Indeed," or "How fascinating," but her eyes, the beautiful dark eyes that had once danced with mischief and warmth, were vacant. They were like polished stones, reflecting the candlelight but holding none of it within. He watched her for what felt like an eternity, his own food growing cold on his plate. He saw the perfection everyone else admired, but he saw the cage beneath it. He saw the pins in her hair not as decoration, but as nails holding her together. He saw the crown not as a symbol of her station, but as a leaden weight pressing her down into this cold, silent abyss. He remembered a time, at a much smaller, less formal feast, when she had laughed so hard at a joke told by his court jester that wine had come out of her nose. He remembered the horrified gasp she'd given, the blush that had flooded her cheeks, and then the way her eyes had met his across the table, sparkling with shared, uninhibited mirth. He had fallen in love with her all over again in that moment. That woman was gone. He had murdered her. He had taken that vibrant, living, beautifully imperfect woman and replaced her with this cold, beautiful doll. The thought was a physical blow. The drone of conversation faded. The rich food tasted like ash in his mouth. He could not bear another moment of it. He could not sit beside this perfect stranger and pretend this was a victory. He pushed his chair back, the harsh scrape of wood on stone cutting through the noise of the hall. Every head turned toward him. A hush fell over the room. He stood, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the table. His voice, when he spoke, was not the measured tone of a king. It was the raw, ragged command of a desperate man. "Leave us," the words cracked like a whip in the sudden silence. There was a moment of stunned confusion. The lords and ladies exchanged uncertain glances. The Southern ambassador's mouth hung slightly agape. Alaric's gaze swept the room, and it was the gaze of the king they all feared, the one who had forged a nation from war and fire. There was no room for argument in that look. "Now," he commanded, his voice lower, more dangerous. The spell broke. A frantic, rustling scramble began as hundreds of guests rose from their seats. Chairs scraped, goblets clattered, and a river of silks and velvets flowed toward the great oaken doors. No one spoke. No one dared to look at the king or his silent queen. Within a minute, the vast, echoing hall was empty. The doors boomed shut, leaving Alaric and Clara alone in the sea of guttering candles and the wreckage of a feast. The silence that descended was absolute, a heavy blanket that smothered all sound. It was the same silence that had lived between them for months, but now, in the vast emptiness of the hall, it was unbearable. Clara had not moved. She had not even turned her head to watch the exodus. She remained in her seat, a silver statue at the head of an empty table, her hands still folded, her posture perfect. She was waiting for her next command. Alaric's heart hammered against his ribs. He knew what he had to do. This could not be undone with words alone. An apology would be a meaningless sound in the void he had created. He needed to tear down the prison he had built around her, piece by piece. He did not beg. He did not plead. He walked. He moved from behind the high table, his steps echoing on the stone floor. He walked the length of the dais until he stood behind her chair. She did not tense. She did not acknowledge his presence in any way. She simply sat, her stillness a monument to his cruelty. He reached out, his hands trembling slightly, and his fingers brushed the cold, heavy gold of her crown. For a moment, he hesitated. This was the symbol of everything he had demanded she become. Lifting it felt like a blasphemy against the very order he had imposed. He took a breath, his resolve hardening. Gently, deliberately, he took hold of the crown and lifted it from her head. It was heavier than he expected. He set it down on the table with a soft, metallic thud. The sound was deafening in the silence. Without the crown, her hair looked impossibly complex, a fortress of braids and coils. His work was not done. He moved to stand in front of her, forcing her to look at him, but her gaze remained fixed on the space just past his shoulder. "Clara," he whispered, his voice rough with unshed tears. She did not respond. Her face was a perfect, beautiful mask. He reached for her hair. His fingers, clumsy and large, fumbled with the first pearl-tipped pin. It was sunk deep into a tight coil of hair. He worked it free, his touch surprisingly gentle. He pulled it out and laid it on the table beside the crown. He moved to the next one, and the next. One by one, he began to dismantle the perfect, rigid structure. A thick strand of dark hair, freed from its prison, fell softly against her cheek. She flinched, a tiny, almost imperceptible tremor. It was the first genuine reaction he had seen from her in months, and it gave him a surge of desperate hope. He continued, working with a focused intensity, pulling pin after pin from her hair. With each one, another piece of the elaborate construction came undone. A braid unspooled over her shoulder. A coil unwound, brushing against her neck. The hair that had been scraped back so severely began to soften around her face, framing it in a way he had not seen since before the ball. It was messy. It was imperfect. It was beautiful. He kept going until the last pin was removed and her hair, all of it, cascaded down around her shoulders, a heavy, dark curtain of silk, smelling faintly of lavender. It fell across her face, shielding her from his view. He knelt before her, so their eyes were on the same level. He gently pushed a stray lock of hair from her cheek. "I commanded you to be a queen," he admitted, his voice cracking, the words tasting like poison and regret. "I told you to be perfect. To be flawless. And you, in your terrible, beautiful obedience, you did exactly as I asked." He looked at the statue he had made, and his heart broke. "Now," he said, his voice dropping to a raw, ragged plea. "Now I command you to stop." He saw a flicker in the depths of her empty eyes. A spark. A memory of light. "I don't want the statue," he choked out, the admission tearing through him. "I don't want the Ice Queen. I want my wife. I want Clara." For a long moment, she said nothing. She simply stared at him, her face half hidden by the beautiful chaos of her hair. He saw the smooth, placid mask she had worn for so long begin to fracture. It started with a tremor in her lower lip, a tiny, uncontrollable quiver. Then her perfect posture wavered, her shoulders slumping just a fraction of an inch. A single tear welled in her eye, impossibly bright in the candlelight, and traced a slow, glittering path down her cheek. It was a crack in the dam. And then another tear followed, and another. The mask did not just crack, it crumbled. It disintegrated into dust, revealing the raw, wounded, terrified woman beneath. A sound escaped her lips, a choked, broken sob that was the most beautiful thing he had ever heard. It was a sound of pain, of release, of life. She launched herself from the chair and into his arms, her body racked with great, shuddering sobs. He fell back on the stone floor, pulling her with him, holding her tight against his chest as if he could physically piece her back together. She wept. She wept for the humiliation, for the endless hours of painful training, for the woman she had been forced to kill. She wept for the silence and the loneliness and the crushing weight of his expectations. Her tears soaked the front of his royal tunic, a warm, wet stain of grief and absolution. He buried his face in her messy, unpinned hair, inhaling the scent of her, the real scent of her, and whispered her name over and over again. "Clara. Clara. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." They were inadequate words, pebbles thrown into a chasm of his own making, but they were all he had. He held her on the cold floor of the empty great hall, surrounded by the ghosts of a feast, and for the first time in months, he was not a king holding his queen. He was a man holding his wife, and he prayed to any god that was listening that it was not too late to find her again. He held her until the last of the 1,000 candles began to sputter and die, plunging the hall into a soft, forgiving gloom. The storm of her weeping slowly subsided into quiet, exhausted tremors. She was limp in his arms, her head resting on his shoulder, her breath catching in small, hiccuping sighs. He could feel the warmth of her body seeping through his clothes, a living, breathing heat that felt like a sunrise after a long, frozen night. He shifted, carefully, so he could look at her face. Her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen, her cheeks streaked with tears, her hair a wild tangle around her. She looked utterly broken and more beautiful than she had in the flawless silver gown. She looked real. "Alaric," she whispered, her voice raw and fragile. It was the first time she had used his name in what felt like a lifetime. The sound of it on her lips was a balm to his soul. "I tried," she said, her voice catching. "I tried so hard to be what you wanted, I know," he murmured, his thumb stroking her tear-stained cheek. "You were perfect. You were a perfect queen. And I was a fool. I was a cruel, proud fool." He pulled back slightly, needing her to see the truth in his eyes. "I asked you to destroy the part of you that I loved the most. Your warmth. Your light. I saw it as a weakness, because I was afraid. Afraid of the whispers in court, afraid of looking weak myself. I tried to forge you into a weapon, a shield for my own pride, and I nearly destroyed you in the process." She didn't offer him easy forgiveness. She simply watched him, her gaze searching his face, looking for the man she had married beneath the king who had condemned her. He saw the pain there, but he also saw a flicker of something else, something tentative and fragile, understanding. He had been a king, ruling by command. Now, he had to be a husband, and learn to ask. "Can you forgive me, Clara?" he asked, the words feeling small and insufficient for the magnitude of his crime. "Can we find our way back?" She didn't answer with words. Instead, she lifted a trembling hand and laid it against his jaw. Her touch was hesitant at first, then firmer. It was not the inert contact of the statue, it was a choice. A connection. She leaned in and rested her forehead against his. They stayed like that for a long time, breathing together in the near darkness, the silence between them no longer a chasm but a shared space of quiet, fragile healing. There were no more commands to give. There was only the slow, difficult work of rebuilding, stone by painful stone, the kingdom of two they had once shared. The journey back was not a simple one. The next morning, Alaric awoke to find Clara's side of the bed empty. A sliver of panic, cold and sharp, pierced his chest. He rose and found her by the window, wrapped in a simple dressing gown, staring out at the dawn. Her hair was still loose, falling in soft waves down her back. When she heard him approach, she turned, and he saw her instinctively straighten her posture, the old training etched into her very muscles. But then she seemed to catch herself. She visibly relaxed her shoulders, a small, conscious act of defiance against the queen he had made. A wobbly, uncertain smile touched her lips. It was the first genuine smile he had seen in months, and it was like watching a flower bloom after a brutal winter. He did not command her to breakfast. He went to the kitchens himself, shocking the staff into stunned silence, and brought back a tray. It was a clumsy effort. He spilled some of the juice, and the toast was slightly burned. He set it down on a small table near the window. "I thought, we could eat here," he said, feeling as nervous as a young suitor. She looked at the tray, at his earnest, hopeful face, and a real laugh, soft and rusty from disuse, bubbled up from her chest. "You are a terrible servant, my king," she said, the gentle teaser melody he had thought he would never hear again. "I am," he agreed, his heart swelling. "But I hope to become a better husband." The court was a more difficult beast to tame. They had grown accustomed to the Ice Queen, and her sudden thaw was a source of confusion and gossip. At the next council meeting, when a minor lord made a condescending remark, assuming her silence meant she was merely decorative, Clara spoke. Her voice was quiet, but it was no longer the flat, emotionless tone of the automaton. It was laced with an iron he had never heard before. She calmly and methodically dismantled the lord's argument with a clarity and insight that stunned the entire room into silence. She had been listening all those months, observing, learning. She had forged her own kind of strength in the crucible of his making. When she finished, she looked at Alaric, a question in her eyes. He gave her a slow, proud nod. He was no longer her commander, but her ally. There were still days when the ghost of the Ice Queen would return. Moments of stress when she would retreat into a silent, rigid stillness. Times when she would catch her reflection and he would see a flicker of the stranger in her eyes. But he learned to be patient. He would not command her to feel, but he would invite her to. He would bring her a wildflower from the garden. He would read to her from her favorite book of poetry, his voice soft in the firelight. He would reach for her hand, not with the expectation of a king, but with the hope of a husband, and more often than not, her fingers would curl around his, a silent answer to a question he was finally learning how to ask. One evening, months later, there was music in the garden, a small quartet playing for no other reason than the beauty of a summer night. Alara stood by the fountain, watching the fireflies. Alaric came to her side. He didn't speak. He simply held out his hand. She looked at it, then up at his face. 100 emotions played across her features. Memory, pain, fear, and then, finally, a slow, dawning hope. She placed her hand in his. He led her to a small patch of open grass, and in the soft glow of the lanterns, he began to dance with her. It was not the formal, precise dance of the ballroom. It was a clumsy, gentle sway, a quiet shuffle under the stars. At one point, she stumbled, her foot catching on a root. She gasped, her body tensing for a moment in remembered fear. But Alaric only held her tighter. "It's all right," he murmured into her hair. "I've got you." She looked up at him, and in the starlight, he saw that her eyes were shining, not with tears of grief, but with a light he thought he had extinguished forever. She was not the clumsy girl he had shamed, nor the perfect queen he had created. She was Clara. She was his wife. And she was, finally, home.